So when I started in web development in general, the thought process didn't make sense to me when I tried to think about how do I get a file from my computer to a website or wherever that lives in the internet. And FTP, what we're going to be talking about today, is one of the few ways that you can actually have a file from your local machine, your computer, and get that on the web server so you can actually interact with that file. And me and Chris want to talk about that today, what FTP is. And once again, my name is Jake Schaap. I'm a full stack web developer, been doing this for almost a decade now. Love helping out as many people as I possibly can in this fun world of web stuff.
And I am Chris Brundage. I'm a beginner programmer, just getting into it with 0 years of experience. And this is the base case YouTube series where hopefully we're going to take things from a beginner perspective and an expert perspective and try to break apart some of these things and make it simpler, like what we're talking about today, FTP, File Transfer Protocol. No idea, but we're going to hopefully break it down in a simple way.
Yep. And if you enjoy this content that me and Chris are putting together, please like, share, and subscribe this video, our channel. Every comment that you add in there, we will absolutely answer and reply to each and every one, because we are doing this for you, someone that is possibly starting out in web technologies, or someone that has been in web technologies for several years and just needs a refresher course on what all of this technology is based on web. So appreciate the support. Thank you for checking out Base Case. So Chris, I'm going to pass this over to you and say, what do you know about FTP?
Very little, just really the name. And I actually have some questions here that we can get into a little bit later. But from what I can gather, I know the name is File Transfer Protocol. I know it has to do something again with security and possibly encryption. I'm not sure. And really that's it. That's all I know.
Yeah, so it can be associated with security and encryption. So there's FTP file transfer protocol, which is saying really is you are transferring one file from your computer to the web server. And why you would want to do that is, like we talked about in previous videos, the way that a website works is that it's essentially a collection of files that you access within your browser. So index.html, all the different images, the CSS files. And so you need a way to create this HTML, this CSS, the content that is actually displayed in your browser. You need a way to create that on your local machine, laptop, but you also need to get that on the web server somehow. And FTP it's kind of a manual process of just like, think of it as like, I'm a Windows user. So I use File Explorer. And so you can drag and drop files from like one folder or one directory to another. That's essentially how FTP works, is you're dragging your file from your local machine to a file directory on the actual web server itself. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So so I've got the HTML, the CSS, I've got, again, just like the last video, I've got all my website built. I can view it. I can click on the buttons. I can fill out the forms, everything like that. Now, dragging and dropping all those files, I'm dragging and dropping them to where? Is this the host, like whoever the host is that's I've paid to use, right? So that everybody can access from the internet, view those from their browser. Am I dragging and dropping all those files physically, or at least on the screen, from there to the host then?
Yes, absolutely. So when you set up a website, you purchase two things primarily: a domain name, so www.whatever.com, and then you're also purchasing a hosting provider, like what Chris mentioned. And what that typically looks like is more of the cheaper options are what's called cPanel. cPanel is pretty much a a pretty user interface that will allow you to interact with a file explorer on the web server. It'll give you your different IP addresses, a database if you're working with. You could set up your SSL certificate in the cPanel. So there's a lot of different things that you can create for your website specifically. And that one thing, the one important thing that we're talking about today is what cPanel, I believe, called File Manager. And they, once you purchase a hosting plan, will provide you essentially a space on a server somewhere, whoever you purchase your hosting plan from. They'll provide you a space where you can upload all your files, typically in a directory called public_HTML. You can then create all of your directories and files that live within that public_HTML folder on their web server. And then within your hosting provider, wherever you purchase, like your domain, you would point that .com that you purchased specifically to that file server that you just uploaded all those files into. So when someone accesses your website in a browser, your .com will point directly to that file server that you uploaded all your files into via FTP.
Okay, so you said via FTP, file transfer protocol. Is this, is it, again, is this a set of rules? Is it a standardized thing across the web? Is it per host? What is FTP? And aside from that drag and drop feature that you just described, what is FTP, file transfer protocol? Where does it come into play? Like actually the machine is, or machines are using it.
Yeah, it's one of several different ways really that you could transfer files and information from your local, from one destination to another, honestly, because it doesn't necessarily need to be from your local machine, because there's FTP, what we're talking about. There's SFTP, which is secure file transfer protocol, and what having to do with security and encryption and whatnot, moving files from one location to another. There's you could use automated deployments that will also use FTP. So what that looks like is you're creating some local code and you hit save, and then you push up to your source control, your GitHub repository. And then once you push that up, this is definitely another discussion for another day for sure, source control. But once you commit your code to your source control, that'll then kick off an automated deployment using your FTP credentials to automatically transfer your files from your local machine to your web server. So there's automated tools, there's manual ways to do this. There's secure and non-secure ways. There's also what's called SSH protocol, which is secure sock.
Nope, that's not SSH. I'm gonna look that up right now. Feel free to keep this on camera because I can't remember the acronym.
Secure shell is SSH. I had to Google that. But that's just another protocol that allows you to transfer data from one location to another. And all of this really, it's not to be complicated. It's just a matter of preference. Sometimes it's a matter of security. These all use different ports to transfer data as well. So like FTP is port 21, SFTP is port 22. And I'll give it back to you in a second, Chris, because I know I'm talking about a lot. I'm sure you have a ton of questions. There's also a very popular FTP client on your computer called FileZilla. Pretty much like 9.5 times out of 10, someone's going to use FileZilla as the main computer client to use to set up FTP. So you need 3 things to set up an FTP, and then I'll shut up. You need a host, which is either like a .com of where things are actually going into, or an IP. They're interchangeable. You need a username and a password. And that's it. And then you can start to transfer things back and forth between your local machine and your browser. I'm sure you have a ton of questions, Chris.
I do. I don't know which one to pick at. Like I said last time, it's like every time we talk about this stuff, it's like you open up a jar of butter or fireflies. And they
Yeah.
were just scattering. You know? I don't know which one to grab.
That's why I'm taking notes.
Yes, I'm definitely taking notes. I think so. As far as I understand it, is this a setting, right? Like kind of like you're choosing a setting, or is this something that's mandatory that the host will provide to you, and you have to pick which one, and then it's just inherent from that point on, or how does it work as far as me?
Yeah, that's a decent question. So yes, it could depend on the host that you have that will allow you what type of access you have to the server, because sometimes based on the type of hosting package that you have, the hosting provider may not allow you to use SSH, but they will give you access to FTP. Or I've seen many times in the past where novice developers or non-developers in general will think that, like, not to call them out or anything, but GoDaddy's one where they offer a WordPress specific hosting plan. It's supposed to be optimized for WordPress websites. But the problem for more technical people that start to get in there and see what's what, when you actually look at some of the setup that GoDaddy's actually doing, is they either remove some of the access to directories through FTP, or they lock down some things, they move things around. So the file structure is different from server, which is definitely very confusing for a lot of beginners, for sure, to be able to figure out where to even put something once you log in. But I want to share my screen real fast and show you exactly how this would work, because I think this will clarify. So on my screen, you'll have the client FileZilla. And this is what I was saying, like 9.5 times out of 10 people will use this. And so here's just one of the many things that logins that you could that I have stored, that I have saved on my client. And so I'll click on one. So this is what I was talking about when I say you'll need a host. So this is something that the hosting provider will offer you. So it's either going to be FTP dot whatever your domain is, or it could also be an IP address, one dot, and I got a comma in there, but something like that. And then it gives you the ability to choose FTP or SFTP. So I'll just stick with FTP because I'm setting the specific protocol. It automatically knows what the port is, but FTP is port 21, so you can or enter that if you want. And then SFTP is port 22. And then when you have all this input, and I'm going to set that back to what it was, and then you have a username, and then you have a password. And then all I'm going to do is hit connect. And hopefully it works, because I haven't used this in a little while. Maybe I misspelled that. There we go. Okay, so this was one I had a little bit of issues with logging into that first one. So we tried a couple others, me and Chris, and we got this one working. Apparently, I need to update some of my credentials. But I'm on a second screen here, by the way. That's why I'm looking off here. But you can see here that when I accessed another FTP server, this is my local directory of files. I don't necessarily want to move this stuff around because I have no idea where I am in my computer right now, my directory. But here's a ton of files. And then here this is a web server. So I can click into one of these, and I can drill down into directories, and I can look at all this stuff. And this is a website. These are all the files that are associated with a WordPress website. And if I had all of these files on my local machine, I can drag and drop all this stuff on my local machine and off my local machine. So if I make a change in my VS Code, my code editor on a file, I could then save it make sure that it was updated in here, and then just drag it right over to the file server, and it takes like less than a second to update. And then once that's all updated, I just open up the browser and then refresh, make sure my cache is clear, that, you know, so the browser isn't holding on to any old data, and that's it. So that's really FTP in a nutshell. It's more of a manual process, but you can also use like automated processes to do this too. Do you have any questions about this, Chris, before I stop sharing?
I do. I totally understand the part of going, you know, this on the left side of the screen on the bottom. It's showing the files that are on your machine, right? On your laptop, on your PC, whatever.
Mhm.
You drag them onto the server on the right, the lower right, right?
Mhm.
I get that. That's fine. I can accept that part. The FTP part, though, what in the is where is that coming in from the drag from here to here?
FTP is what is making this possible to happen, to allow me to drag a file from my local to the web server. FTP is the protocol that allows me to transfer a file from one place to another. That's what FTP is.
Is it something that's protecting both you and the server in that because obviously it's got to go through, right? It's got to go across the internet to its destination. Is it coming into play there? Is it like a certain set of rules? Is it a certain set of, it's you know, it says protocol in there. Is it like I don't know how else to put it. Is it like a certain set of rules or industry standards that have to be in place in order for this transfer to happen?
I wouldn't say industry standards necessarily. There are specific permissions that are set per file and directory. So for every file and directory, you have read, write. Why am I'm having a brain fart? Where is it? Sorry, my light was hiding. My light's like right here. So rewrite and execute. So what that means is read, you have the ability to pull the file up and you can actually see it, but you can't actually change anything. Write is like you can actually change something and save it. And then execute is pretty similar, where you have the ability to just write to it, execute, and kind of do everything to that file. So these are permissions that are associated, like I said, with the file and the directory specifically. So you can have the ability from the server side to say, you don't, you know, you as a user with these FTP credentials, you don't have the ability to write to a file on the server. You can view the file, you can pull it up on your local editor, and you can see what's in it, but you don't have the ability to update the file at all. So you can set specific rules and permissions on like the files and directories themselves. Does that answer your question?
Sort of. I feel like there's a bunch of people out there, if they watch this, they're screaming at me, being like, why don't you get it yet? But I think we're getting closer. I guess maybe this would help clarify. When I choose a host, right? And I'm going through this process, why is it important for me to choose FTP? And if I get to this point here, why is it important for me to choose FTP and click that?
Because, yeah, it's a good question. And I don't want to go back real fast. I think just to provide some context to this video in general, Chris may not understand or get this entire concept because Chris has never done this before. So like, if you haven't ever needed to do FTP, I totally understand why you don't get it, Chris. Totally get it. And going back to your question, why would you choose FTP? Because the alternative is for you to manually create files one by one on the web server itself, which they don't really give you like good graphical like editors like VS Code or like Visual Studio, or what IDE do you use? I don't know.
Visual Studio Code, yeah.
Yeah. So if you're creating that, they don't give you, you know, syntax help. They don't give you like all of the cool tools that you get in your local IDE. You would have to like manually type stuff out file per file, like on the actual web server itself. And it's just not convenient way to do that. So it's more, it's easier, it's more convenient for you to develop code locally. And then once it's ready to deploy to the web, use a protocol like FTP to transfer all of your files from your local machine to your web server completely. Like you can just drag and drop an entire directory full of files and it will happen like within seconds. It'll transfer to the server, as opposed to you one by one, very painfully creating and moving around files on the actual web server itself.
Okay. I saw, as I was looking this up, and correct me if I'm wrong, because you were more obviously in this business than I am. Google Chrome, and Firefox, I believe it was said 2021 have dropped FTP. Do you know anything about that? I believe what it said was Firefox first dropped it, and then Google Chrome followed suit.
I have no idea what you're talking about. Because and I don't know if you want to keep this information for the video or not, but that honestly doesn't make sense to me, because the browser doesn't have anything to do with FTP necessarily, because the browser is just the way to view the files that you're transferring. Like FTP is the protocol that you're transferring data from one place to another. Like the browser is just the way for you to view that content that you have on the web. So the two really aren't related.
Okay, I have another question for you.
Bring it.
So is this something, that screen that you pulled up, FileZilla, right?
Yep.
When does that come into play?
That is a free download that anyone can install. Don't have to pay for it. If someone tells you have to pay for it, you're probably downloading a malicious file, so don't do it. And that comes into play pretty early on when you want to actually, you know, get a website up and running. So for example, I have been awful at updating my jakeshapp.com website, and it was totally irrelevant of the content and what I've been working on over the past several years. So today, actually, I wanted to get something up as kind of a placeholder that speaks to kind of where I'm at in my journey of just being you know, a web thought leader. And so all I did was I added 2 files to the web server. So I created jakeshapp.com. I pointed it to my cPanel hosting web provider. I use Namecheap, not really sponsored by them or anything. I just use them. And I created an index.html file, and I added 1 image. And that's it. It's essentially a landing page. So you go on there, you go to jakeshapp.com, and you just see, hey, I introduce myself. I tell people what I'm working on or what I'm working towards. I've been doing this since 2013, and that's it. So how I transferred those 2 files was I used FTP to transfer the files that I've created in my VS Code over to the web server. So I don't know if that answers your question specifically, but it really, FileZilla, you can use it as just a manual drag and drop process to get files from your local machine to your web server.
Okay, I think we're getting closer. I still don't know exactly, you know, if I'm sure if we had this might actually be a good place to say these kind of things are good to look up on your own, right? This is some of this kind of stuff, like we mentioned in the last video, you don't need to memorize every little tiny detail of it. But I think thank you very much for showing that screen, because it kind of helps. And it's an app, right? FileZilla.
Yes.
Yeah. So seeing that's a separate app, here's your files on one side, here's the server on the other. You can drag and drop using the FTP feature.
Yeah, and I just to clarify too, FileZilla is a client that uses FTP. FileZilla is not FTP. FTP is the protocol that FileZilla uses to transfer data. I just want there to be clarity on that FileZilla is not FTP, FTP is not FileZilla. And I think people think that a lot. So want to clarify.
Can you repeat that again?
Yeah.
If you remember what you said.
Yeah. So I just want to be clear that FileZilla uses FTP as the protocol to transfer files. FileZilla is not FTP, and FTP is not FileZilla. FileZilla is just one client of many that can use FTP to transfer files from one place to another.
Okay, I think that made a bigger connection in my head. Just understanding that there can be different applications that use this file transfer protocol.
Yes.
When you are moving files from your machine to the server.
Yep.
Okay, that helps out a lot. Thank goodness. Okay. All right, so I could create my own, it's not going to happen, but I could create my own app for this purpose. In there is a feature to use FTP, the file transfer protocol. You can choose that, and that will be used.
Yeah, like what I was alluding to earlier too, when you have like automated deployments, a lot of times when you're pumping out code really fast and like a larger team, you really want to automate this whole deployment process of getting code up to the server as fast as possible. And those automated deployment tools, which there are many of them, they use SFTP and FTP to transfer all this content to the web. So they, like many other tools, use FTP to transfer stuff.
Okay, I got you. It's getting a little more clear. The fog is clearing, thankfully. Who's in charge? I have this written down. Who's in charge of FTP? Is there a company? Is it an organization? Or is it like a client by client basis? Is it an app by app basis?
That is an awesome question. I don't know. What happens when you type in who is in charge? Who is in charge of FTP? I have never even thought to ask that question. That's a good question. I got some random name that came up. Developers, Abe Bouchon. Introduction, FTP was introduced in 1971.
Okay, yeah, I read that part too.
Summary of FTP client, IBM comes up. I feel like they might have something to do with it. The the first thing that pops into my head when you asked that question was the w3.org. W3.org, they have a huge hand in like just the overall development of the web in general. They specify like all of the, how can I word this? They determine all the different specifications for like HTML, what is actually being used on these different browsers. So web3.org, I think that's probably going to be a big association with the FTP, but I don't know for sure. And that's a good question.
No, that's fine. I know that because when I first started learning programming, Python has a really good, I think it's even just realpython.org. I believe that's the name. But it's a specific site that you can, I thought it was really cool that there's like a panel that develops Python code. There's a certain amount of people, I don't know the number, but you go on there and it's got pretty much anything and everything Python right there. And it's super fun to look at, super easy to download different, new updates and whatnot. So I wonder if it's kind of the same thing, if it's, and this is something again that maybe we can get to the next video, answer that or not, or whoever's watching this can actually look that up and let us know if you find it, who's in charge of FTP.
I think that's like a whole nother video in itself of just like, all right, here's the standard protocols and the things that people legit just take for granted that it's there, and like who's actually running this stuff, who's in charge of it, and should we care or not. I think that's a great video topic because honestly, like I've said, I haven't even thought about this. I just know that it exists and how it works.
Right. Yeah. Or even if it's like an industry wide, you know, if other people have different implementations of it, you know, could be
Yeah.
something like that too. So yeah, that's definitely worth digging down into. It would be really cool if somebody watching this knew that. Is there anything negative to consider with FTP? Things that you've experienced over the years that maybe have been troublesome, maybe some mistakes that you've made that you didn't consider that you had to go back to? Are there problems that you can run into? Anything? Is there anything negative to FTP that you've had experience with, or things to look out for and be cognizant of as you're transferring files from your machine to the server?
For sure. Yeah. The first thing that comes to my head is make sure you have a backup of what you're updating, to make sure that when you overwrite changes or you're moving files one place to another, that because when you move a file from one place to another and that file already exists in that web server, it will, FileZilla or any other FTP client will ask you, do you want to overwrite this? And when you overwrite it, that file's gone. So if you don't have either source control, GitHub, a backup on your local machine of the files and the information that you're overwriting, that information's gone forever. So you want to make sure that you have regular ongoing backups of your web servers. And that goes across the board for anything that me and Chris are talking about. So definitely make sure that happens. Also, with a lot of these FTP clients, sometimes the user interfaces are sometimes wonky, and so you can end up either moving a file into a directory that you had no idea where you put it, and it's difficult to find and search files in an FTP directory because there really isn't much of a searching functionality in most of these FTP clients. So if you accidentally click on a file and then drag it into a directory, and then you're like, crap, where did I put that file? Like, it might just end up somewhere and you have to like individually go through each and every directory just to get your file back and then restore it back to where you put it. So that's happened several times, and it could definitely easily happen to a lot of people. Just I'm trying to think of if there's anything else major that I've ever run into. FTP logging is a huge benefit, and hopefully your hosting provider helps you gain access to logs. And what I mean by that is a lot of times you will create files, and me and Chris, we talk about full stack stuff a lot on this channel. So when you're creating like backend files or even front end that have different errors in them, and you load a web page and you see something break on the front end of the site, you want to make sure that there's some sort of access logging or error logging happening on your server somewhere that you can access, so you can look at that log and say, oh, this file on this line is breaking because of the code that I just wrote. Not all hosting providers provide that, and a lot of the time the logs are very cryptic and hard to figure out what is actually going wrong, but sometimes they are helpful, and it is very helpful to know where to find those on the FTP directory. And there could be, they could be in different places on that FTP directory as well. And I think I'll leave you with this point to this question, Chris. Not all web servers are created equal. So we talked about, especially when it comes to like directory order and location and where to find everything. We talked about initially in this video that a typical like cPanel hosting setup, you will find your public _ HTML directory. You'd put all your files in that directory, and that will serve up your website. Well, if you use a very standard, bare bones Linux server setup with Apache web server set up on it, it could use all of the Linux based like var and etc and like the weird 3-letter directory names that you would only see on a Linux machine. you might access an FTP server, then all of a sudden you're just like, well, where's the public HTML directory? It's not there because it's using a totally different web server setup. And you just need to know from experience or Googling or Stack Overflow, like you just need to know, like your website's actually nested like 3 or 4 levels deep in a directory that you just need to find from the root directory when you actually log in via FTP. So there's a lot that could go wrong. There's a lot to be aware of, and there's just a lot that you will come across just by using it and getting experience with it.
Yeah, that part there. I think the thing for me is that I don't follow along with a lot of this. I sort of get it, I get the general idea of this. I think it's something that you need to run into. I think it's something that when it gets to that point, kind of get used to looking at it. The thing you said with logs, right? Logs.
Mhm.
Does that come from the server, from the host?
From the server.
From the server, okay.
Yep.
And you just showed me FileZilla, and then you look over into the server side. Is it going to be in there, those logs?
Once again, they might be in different places. So first off, you need to make sure that the web server is allowing logs to be written. A lot of websites and web servers don't even out of the box allow logs to be created. So you need to enable that either in your cPanel or your website. And then once that's enabled to actually write logs and something blows up on your site, then you have to know, honestly, from experience or Googling, like where to find this, or last case scenario, reach out to your cPanel support team and see if they can point you in the right direction. In my experience, hosting support isn't normally helpful. So once you get to know, where to find things, you'll pretty much figure it out, because it'll either be in 3 or 4 different places every once in a while, these log files. But yeah, so first, make sure they're enabled. And then second of all, they're typically in like standard locations most of the time on a web server.
Okay. Can you give me, as to the best of your ability, a simple step-by-step process that I'm going to run into eventually, right? As I get my sites up and running, kind of everything else to the side. Could you give me just a quick down and dirty step-by-step process of what's going to be involved, what to look for? You mentioned FileZilla, obviously use that one, that part of it, and then the after you drag and drop, what's after that, if anything?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'll start from, you want to create a basic 1-page website. You will purchase a domain and hosting plan from Namecheap, like I said, because that's who I use. Depending on, by the way, how can I say this? Depending on what you're trying to build, you should definitely consider the hosting plan to make sure that you're hosting and deploying to the proper server settings, and that can definitely be a whole other discussion. But we're keeping this super high level. So you purchase your domain name, you purchase your hosting plan. Once you purchase your hosting plan, you log into your cPanel and you create your FTP credentials. You will need to actually manually create those, your username, your password. When you create those, you get your host, which is that either ftp.yourdomainname.com or IP address. So you got your 3 things that you need to actually access via FTP your web server: host, username, password. You open up your IDE, you start coding a page. You got your HTML, you got your CSS, maybe you got a click event in there with your JavaScript because you're feeling frisky, and you got everything in your index.html file. And everything's ready to go. You actually open up that index.html file on your local browser, because you can do that. You can right click it and open in your browser before you even pull it over into your web server. You can review that it actually works in your browser before you even move it over. If it looks good, you're happy with it, it's responsive-ish, then that's the time that you pull out those credentials that you just created for your FTP. You download and install FileZilla. You add in your host, your username and password for FTP. And if those credentials work, which they should, because you just created them, and hopefully you remember your darn password you just created, you will then see your root level FTP, your root level web server directory. And then most likely you'll see, like we talked about, your public underscore HTML file or your public underscore HTML directory. Then you will drag and drop from your local machine that index.html onto your web server. You will then make sure, well, out of the box, your new domain name that you purchased should automatically be pointed to that same public underscore HTML 9.5 times out of 10. That will be pointed correctly. You won't have to do anything. So once you purchase that domain name along with the hosting plan, if you purchase them together, they will already automatically be set up. So when you go to your new domain name, you will see your index.html file there, and your changes that you made. Do a hard refresh, like Control F5, just to make sure you're clearing all your cache. You should see your changes when you go to your domain name. And if you don't, the only caveat to all of this is a lot of times new hosting plans will have a placeholder file in there for when you purchase a host, or when you purchase a domain and a host for the first time. They may have a placeholder file in there that you'll have to remove. Then you can see your index.html. And lastly, it is super important that your primary, if you're only doing one page, you need that file to either be index.html or index.php. Otherwise, your web server will not recognize it as the primary file for your web server, and therefore will not show anything when you go to that domain name that you just purchased, and you'll see an error message in your browser.
Just go on that real quick. The placeholder, the school I went to and free code camp that I'm using now. So it seems to be, I didn't know this part. I just thought maybe it was just, just practice or whatever to put index.html, Visual Studio Code. I can write my code and we go on from there. So you mentioned that there's a placeholder in there that you have to physically, click and remove before you can see your index.html, and it has to be called index.html. Can you just briefly explain that a little bit more?
Yes, it has to be named index.html, not only because of testing, or that's just kind of like the standard, but web servers are automatically web servers are set up to recognize index.html as the primary file to load. So whenever you operate a JavaScript framework, whenever you operate PHP, CMS, whatever, they're all looking for those two files, either index.html or index.php. And that is how the Linux server specifically, because mostly whenever you're setting up a new hosting plan, it's going to be set up with a Linux Apache web server. That's what they're looking for, is that they're looking for that index file. There is another file in there that's pretty standard to be located in that web server file directory that we can definitely go off onto another video and talk about altogether, which is called htaccess, which gives the more programmatic technical person the ability to do a lot when it comes to server side rendering of the front end content, and gives you the ability to chop off file extensions. So instead of it being index.html, it'll just be your domain name.com/index or whatever. You can control redirects, you can control a lot of stuff in the server. So that might be something else that you would see too when you get in there, which is why that placeholder could potentially be working, because the server is set up in a way initially that it will allow placeholder to work and index, but as soon as index is put in there from you, it will trump like that placeholder thing. So it'll actually show up as kind of like the primary, because that web server is set up in a way to recognize that as the primary file.
I think I blacked out for a second. No, I think it's just stuff that you're gonna have to just go through it to get it.
Yes.
Like a lot of these things, it's like, okay, I understand that word, I understand that word, I understand that word.
Yeah, I mean, yeah,
Not gonna-
it's a matter of, I mean, I remember back when I started like in 2013, like I knew nothing about this stuff at all. It's a matter of, it's honestly a matter of breaking things and learning how things work and not being scared to try stuff. And that's just how it is when you are learning this stuff, is that you have to be willing to get your hands dirty. You have to be willing to and I know this is definitely not for everyone, but to learn to apologize more than, oh no, what's the phrase? Ask for forgiveness instead of permission, because a lot of times you just need to get in there and get your hands dirty and actually try stuff. So like if you need to update a file to see how it affects the site, just go ahead and do it. Like and I know that not all employers are going to agree with my the way I go about doing things, but
Yeah. Yeah, no, that was going to be my question, was when did you run into it? How did you come about it and all that? And I think you've mentioned on the last video too, how it was just, you were kind of just thrown into the deep water and you just had to swim. You just had to break stuff. You just had to click on things. You just had to Google it, whatever it was. And I think there is, I mean, people talk about it all the time in many, many, many different topics, right? Just as human beings, we run into this where we kind of just have to figure stuff out on the fly. If it's not being directly taught to us by a good teacher, which is something that's very hard to come by, some of this stuff like FTP, you're going to run into it. You're going to need to use it. You can do as much Googling as you can before you click on buttons, but it's going to be a part of it. Get used to it. When you run into it, talk to people like Jake, Google, W3 Schools, Geeks for Geeks, whatever the site is, try to figure it out. And I think that's what I'm going to have to kind of do, because and as we go along and as I go through that process too, this stuff that you're saying will eventually make sense. Be like, okay, I see.
Exactly. I mean, yeah, me and Chris, we're putting this out right now for people to come back to, like, get started, get into a scenario where like you actually need to use FTP, and then come back to this video, like write down the times of when me and Chris talked about a certain topic that is not relevant to you now, but maybe relevant in the future. And so once you actually are ready to push a file up to the server, you can come back to this video and you can check it out again and leave me and Chris a comment if you have any questions, or we didn't clarify something that you really need clarified, because we definitely didn't touch on it all, and me and Chris are definitely not going to touch on everything because there's so much. But we want to create this content to help people get through this stuff, and so it's a matter of we both have a responsibility. Me and Chris have a responsibility to get you started with this stuff and get you at least a little bit familiar with the technology. But then you also have a responsibility watching this video. If you haven't got into this yet, download it. Like, it's free. It doesn't cost you anything. Download FileZilla. If you have a hosting plan, get your FTP account and credentials set up and start dragging and dropping stuff on the server and seeing what happens. And if it's not a massive live production site that you're bringing down a corporate website or whatever, like, you're not going to get in trouble. Like, test this stuff out, and you have a support team to help. You have you can comment in this video and we can help as well. So that's kind of my rant for the video.
Okay, to wrap this up, why, just like the last video, why is FTP important in general, just for everybody, developers, not developers? Why is it there? Why do we use it? And for programmers specifically, why is it important for us to know?
FTP is one of the primary ways of beginners and expert developers transferring files from one place to another on a web server. It is used in automated deployments, as we've talked about in the past, so it's very popular. It is continued to be used today, and it will continue to be used for many, many years. And also what we talked about in the past, also what we talked about previously in this video, there are several other ways of transferring files as well. It's just a matter of preference. It's a matter of what your hosting provider allows you to do, and it's a matter of what different systems you're working in that will either allow you or not allow you to use FTP. So it is a protocol that will not go away anytime soon, and every developer at one point or another in their career will use it, and that is why FTP is good to know.
Awesome, man. Well, thank you.
Yes, thank you everyone for checking out the video today. Once again, this is Base Case, me and Chris. We put together videos so we can help everybody out that's getting into this, getting into web technologies for the first time, or if you need a refresher on some of this stuff. We are just having conversations and helping people out to the best of our ability, because we want to help people make less mistakes. So if you like this video, please like, share, subscribe, click that bell to be notified when me and Chris come out with more content as we continue to ramp this channel up. And please comment on this video if you have any questions, comments, concerns, things that we could do better, things that we could explain better. We are always open to criticism and ways that we could help people out more, because that's what we're here for.
Yes, sir.